Welcome to Sweden and welcome to my home city, Gothenburg. And congratulations to the prize. How does it feel?
Well, I'm really pleased to see the recognition in Sweden of the importance of the work that we're doing at Bellingcat and more broadly open source investigation, because I personally think it is really important for understanding a whole range of different topics. And the more people who do it, the better.
One thing that I found interesting is that you do not, or you're lacking the background that is perhaps typical before you call yourself a journalist. And I think that is kind of also something that first of all we have in common, but also I always kind of thought that to be a good thing in this media landscape that is, or in the media world that is coming now. The media landscape is so quickly changing, so it's difficult to learn strategies in schools on how to do what and where and so on. And it's somehow just better to go out and just try it. And that's pretty much what happened when you started this career, I guess, as well, right?
Yeah, and I was actually at university doing media studies at a time when it was all being, editing was being done on tape.
Oh, you did media studies?
Yeah, so it was at the period though where editing was being done on tape still, not digitally. So all the skills I was learning would have been completely useless. And then in 2011 there was the Arab Spring, and I was certainly one who spent a lot of time on the internet. And that included being on internet forums and arguing with people over stuff that was being shared. But I just wanted to understand what was happening in these places, not have a kind of debate about the politics of, you know, Gaddafi being great or NATO being evil or vice versa. I just wanted to know, you know, where is this fighting happening so I can understand the conflict. And I realized by analyzing the videos and photographs, you could actually figure that stuff out. But when I say analyze, I mean like what we call geolocation, which is using, you know, reference imagery to figure out exactly where a photograph or video was taken. And 10 years ago, people just weren't doing anything like that. Nowadays, if you look at any conflict, you see loads of people on Twitter geolocating videos, and that helps build this understanding. But yeah, back then it was very, very new, and I just built my skills up over the years, really.
You never consider yourself being a journalist back then?
No, I never really gave myself any title. I was just an interested person who had a blog, and then it just kind of built up. And even now, I wouldn't even call myself a journalist.
Oh, really?
I do acts of journalism into my work, but Bellingcat is really primarily an investigative organisation. But our work is also about spreading the use of open source investigation. So a lot of journalists I speak to are very surprised that we train other journalists to deal with the work that we do. And that includes, you know, training major media organisations who set up their own open source investigation teams. It's like, surely you're doing yourself out of a job. But that's not the point of Bellingcat, is to spread these ideas and techniques, because I've seen how they add value to our understanding of what's happening in the world. It helps, you know, get that granular understanding that I think we need, and I think that we deserve really, of events happening around the world. And if you actually look at how I write, it's very unjournalistic. It's more about
you don't need to be a writing journalist. You could be a researcher or whatever.
Oh, yeah, this is the thing. This is kind of what I struggled with, because I basically taught myself how to write. If you go back and look at my early blog posts, you will see a lot of very bad grammar errors that I'm very embarrassed about. But I kind of was imitating different styles of writing, because it was almost like for me, alongside the investigation, a kind of writing exercise, just kind of learning how to do it. So it really just kind of built up from, you know, not having any knowledge about how to write or be a journalist, and just learning it bit by bit. And a lot of that was enabled by the fact that there were online communities of different shapes and sizes and expertise who started engaging with me. And you know, early on, for example, in Libya, there was a lot of discussion about weapons, you know, found at ammo depots, getting the hands of jihadists and stuff like that. And there were lots of video footage of these ammo depots, and I was sharing them. And that got me in touch with journalists from places like the New York Times who were working on the same issue, and they got to know my work, and they recognized that there was something valuable in what I was doing. So, you know, bit by bit, I built that reputation, that network, and I learned from them as much as they learned from me.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I worked with so many people that in the beginning of their career, they would never label themselves as journalists. But then as their life or their careers went along, it became obvious to everyone else that they are journalists, or they're doing the work of journalists. And they're probably many times doing a work journalistic work better than most other journalists, and that's kind of what I want to do, kind of circle back on as well, and that is kind of a problem for the media houses or the companies that the journalists that are created within the system. Somehow they lack the knowledge, the drive, the interest, or I don't know what they're lacking. Can you see this, or do you agree with this?
Well, I think one thing that when we've done training with news organisations, especially early on, you would get the idea that this was to show journalists something they could do on top of their job, and it doesn't work like that with open source investigation, because you need to be constantly engaged with topics, build a level of expertise in a subject, and understand the open source investigation techniques. And for a lot of journalists, they don't have the option to do that. I mean, in mass media, we've seen, over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of pressure with advertising revenues. It's encouraged a form of journalism on some platforms and websites where it's more about getting clicks than it is about doing interesting investigations. So it gets to the point where some poor journalist is writing up to 8 press releases a day into news stories, and they're finding their jobs being replaced by ChatGPT at the moment. So they don't have the opportunities to actually do investigations because their day-to-day job is just churning out content. And I think because I came from this was like my hobby that I was doing in my spare time, I then managed to crowdfund enough money to make it my job, and it's grown from there over time. But getting to the point where you can be financially sustainable doing this kind of work, for me it was very difficult, and that's why a lot of the stuff we do with Bellingcat now is trying to amplifying other people's work to give them the opportunities to find employment in this sector, because up until I would say about 5 years ago, it's very hard to find a job doing open source investigation.
So the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I find it great that the work, what you're doing is great. I would think everybody agrees with that, but I believe that there's a problem also within the traditional media companies, that they are not as well, or that it needs to be challenged, or that it is challenged by outside individuals or organizations. And I kind of wish it could develop these skills within the media organizations. And perhaps one key is what you've said right now, that it's constructed, or the problem is the business model. The business model is that you have a subscription model. Most of the times you can have clicks as well, I guess, advertising. But the model just promotes journalists that's just part of this big machine, I guess, where you produce stories, and as long as you just do whatever fits the format, you're fine. It doesn't trigger people to do new things, or try new things, or explore new ways to do journalism, and that's kind of a problem here. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think the solution that's kind of offered by traditional media to that has its own set of problems, because there's been really great work done now by teams that have been set up just to do open source investigation. The New York Times visual investigation teams, for example, they've been running for a long time. That was set up by Malachi Brown, who was kind of one of the original community that I was part of, who started doing this kind of thing back in 2011. But to do that, you have to have a lot of money to invest, because you can't just have one guy doing it. You need a team, and that might be okay for good profit-making news organisations, but especially at the level of local media, that's not possible. I mean, they struggle enough with money, and there's in the UK at least, there's loads of issues about where that content comes from, and certainly having an investigative journalism team in one town doing local journalism is not feasible. So in my mind, what you've got to do is more of a kind of partnership with the public, and building a way to create communities at a local level who understand open source investigation. In the UK at the moment, we're developing a program for schools to teach young people how to, first of all, kind of understand the internet and the landscape they're dealing with, how to use tools and this online information to do their own investigations into issues that affect them directly, and just build that skill set up through their kind of teenage years. And then when they get to university level, they already have that inherent understanding that they can be built into whatever topic they decide to pursue. Because it's not just about, I'm going to become a journalist because I've learned these skills. It's about, I've learned good social skills that I can use to empower myself. Because I think also fundamentally, the reason people are drawn into conspiracy theories and negative online communities is because they're looking for a sense of belonging and empowerment, because they feel so detached from the kind of traditional sources of power, governments and the media. They feel that's something that's over there, that's something I can't be part of. But in my own work, I've been able to do that, and it's something that anyone with a laptop can do, really. And if we can teach that to people at a young age, my hope is that also prevents them being drawn into these more negative communities that really feed off their disempowerment. They give them a false sense of empowerment by they're angry, they go online, they find like-minded angry people, they shout at the people on the internet they don't like. Those people feel sad, these people feel like they've done something, empowered, when really it's an illusion of empowerment. And I want to give empowerment that's actually real and has an impact on their lives and in the real world.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great strategy to train the public with a journalistic skill set, kind of, and that is perhaps like in a broader sense that's crucial to creating good societies, but that doesn't really solve the media houses problem. And so what's your view on that? Do media houses needs to be saved? What is the future? How will journalism be in the future? Do we need media houses doing journalism in this traditional way, or will it be developed in?
Yeah, I think we absolutely do need. I think legacy media is important because they do promote journalistic standards for the most part.
Right. Yeah, for the most part.
For the most part.
Sure.
I mean, there's certainly some that don't, but I think that's very important. The idea of having fact checking, verifying your information. If you look at the way, for example, on Twitter, of Elon Musk promoting the idea of citizen journalism, when really it's just a bunch of random accounts who make a lot of noise and get a lot of attention, and they aren't really doing journalism whatsoever. It's just kind of opinions that are half the time wrong. And that idea of kind of citizen journalism, I think, is very dangerous and damaging because it removes any ethical responsibility from those people in many cases. The only kind of ethical responsibility they have is not to get called out too much on Twitter, which is not how things are supposed to be done. At Bellingcat, we actually have a very strong editorial policy. We have an ethics committee that reviews a lot of the work we're doing to look at the ethical issues around that. So there's that kind of element of it. But when you're dealing with kind of traditional news organisations, they do have to adapt to the new reality because they have competitors who are setting up open source investigation teams. And if they don't do that, they're actually missing out on really valuable and useful information. It also means that information that is being generated online, for example, if you look at the conflict on Ukraine, there's lots of videos, information being picked apart and analysed, social media users from a wide variety of backgrounds interacting with each other to understand the conflict more clearly. The problem is if you come to that as an outsider, say as someone from a legacy news media organisation, and you don't understand what they're doing, you can either use that stuff without really understanding what you're using, which can lead to all kinds of risks, or you can ignore it because you think you'll never be able to understand it. But what that is actually a really valuable resource for understanding what's happening in the world. And until you learn to engage with those communities, you're basically missing out on free stuff, basically. It's free, useful information that you just have to be able to process in your organisation to turn into a journalistic output. And it's possible because we've done it all the time in partnership with media organisations, but it's really about taking that first step, get training, build teams.
It is, and for some reason, and perhaps that has to do with the funding, the business models for media companies. They are not doing it, the media companies, or they're not doing it in the extent it should be. That's natural, or that's given to you, and probably to me as well. So what is that? Like, how will that unfold? Like for 10 or 20 years from now, how do you think about who will tell the stories? Will we turn to journalists in the same way that we do today? Will they have the same power? Who will be a journalist in 10 to 20 years?
Well, I think part of the issue is really with legacy media in countries like Sweden, recognising the value of it in their own country, because a lot of open source work has been done on topics like kind of the conflict in Ukraine, in Syria. We've done work on Russian spies and stuff like that. And it's like, how do those media organisations look at that and think, oh, this is something we can do in our way about topics that our audiences are interested in? They don't often see the connection between that kind of conflict reporting and issues that they could be looking at, because they haven't seen the example that clicks with them. So a lot of the work we do is getting out there, training people how to do this, having workshops, getting them to do, apply what we've taught them to the work that they do. So that's kind of part of it, just raising awareness of what actually is possible. But we also have the issue where we have to, if we're talking about journalism students have to be taught about this. Because this is a very, very new field. This has basically emerged from nothing over the last decade. It takes more than a few years to start becoming a topic of academic interest and then that being taught to people. So we have to look at universities and that level of education of, are people being taught about this kind of thing? I think what you're going to see is more and more organisations that are similar to Bellingcat in that they're kind of NGOs doing investigations on certain topics with a heavy use of open source material. Then they'll partner with more traditional media outlets, similar to what we've done in the past. And we've recognised other partners. A good example is Forensic Architecture, who are based in London. They use open source material and very detailed reconstructions using 3D modelling to show what happened. And that combined with more traditional forms of reporting create interesting and engaging content. Yeah. So it's identifying those partnerships. I think really it's this idea of partnering with organisations that are outside of the media, even sometimes part of the media, in interesting ways. And we do that a lot. It has a lot of impact because you aren't just approaching a topic from saying, here's an article on the journalistic investigation we've done. If you're sharing information through open sources, you can be working with a human rights NGO who's able to draw on a certain angle there. You could be working in an organisation that focuses more on advocacy using the evidence that you've gathered. And then as a community of organisations working on the same topic, you kind of attack it from multiple directions rather than just kind of prodding it from one direction.
So is it? So you believe that? Because I was thinking about that as well. How you consider Bellingcat? If it's like a temporary thing that needs to be there right now, in order to media companies to understand, okay, so this is how we should or could do it or do research in a more effective way, or how use open sources or different sources to do better journalism, and then you will teach them and they will kind of catch up, and Bellingcat won't be needed anymore. But from what you've said right now, it sounds more like we will always in the future need these kind of networks, these NGOs or whatever that pools traditional journalists or whatever storytellers there will be to do better, to do new things, because media companies will never be good at it, or how should I understand that?
It's more that when you're dealing with a topic that could be complex, and unless you have a specialisation in not only the investigation techniques but the topic itself, that you might not be able to even start to understand the topic. You combine that with traditional journalism. So, for example, one piece of research we did was looking at border pushbacks in the Mediterranean that Frontex was involved with. And we worked with Lighthouse Reports, which is a Dutch-based NGO that focuses on migration issues. We worked with Der Spiegel, a Japanese TV station. And because open source material was kind of the core to a lot of this investigation, it wasn't like we're using our secret special sources. We could share information, we could share our analysis, but each individual organisation could then draw on their own expertise, be it kind of journalism or investigating migrant issues, to add extra information and do their own publication from it. And because we were working across multiple languages, it didn't matter if a Japanese TV station and a German newspaper was publishing it, because they aren't competitors, they aren't working in the same media environment or space. But it then meant the issue was attacked from multiple angles, which got interest from European members of Parliament, who then started asking questions about this and asking Frontex what's going on with these border pushbacks. Eventually that led to the resignation of the head of Frontex and an entire review of how they operate. Because we came with evidence, we addressed the issue from multiple directions, and it allowed the people who were then taking action on that to trust what we were doing. And then that created more reporting because stuff happened that Spiegel and everyone else could report on. So it worked out, it generates more reporting.
And this was because you had the knowledge and the skill set to find this information and to provide it to traditional media companies, right?
Yeah, it's that kind of analytical ability. Yeah. It's the expertise that you have to have about the migrant, how transfers between Turkey and Greece, and those very granular issues that most people don't really know that well, and generally if they do, it's because they've read about it in a newspaper. So for a journalist, that's not much use, because if you're writing about something you've read in another newspaper, that's not really journalism. But if you are working with other organisations, you have new evidence, and you can build a complete story, then you have something, I think, that you can engage people with. And because you're using video evidence, visual evidence, and stuff that is engaging content, especially online, it works really, really well.
I'm not sure. I would like to go in deeper on the how media will develop over time, because I really that's the key here. We're talking about disinformation and how good you are on finding and revealing what's true or not. But to me, it's also a story on kind of how the traditional media journalists have failed, like we talked about before, failed to not give room to develop these skill sets within the organization itself. And how can we engage the public and put them closer together with our journalists to create these stories? If the public is not good at writing, they're probably good at other things. And we've seen so many cases, especially in Sweden, where the public on boards, forums, wherever, are doing such a great journalistic work in revealing what's true or not in society on a number of things. And in the future, will it be, who will be the storytellers? Will it be the same way as today with these traditional media outlets, or will it be like Bellingcat people, or just regular storytellers, content creators on TikTok or whatever, that kind of creates this skill set and creates this ethic? Because remember, when journalism was created, it was, it was storytellers pretty much that had access to the printing machines, but they didn't have the ethics. The ethics was created, for we trying to mold it out in decades what a journalistic ethic was, and then we figured it out. But in Sweden, it was perhaps 50 or so years before we made ethic newspapers or ethic journalism.
So it's an issue that I think affects more than just journalism. It's really about how the traditional gatekeepers of information, be they journalists, the government, think tanks, anyone, really have lost their kind of position as gatekeepers, but they still think they have it.
Yeah,
it's unique to them.
Yeah.
It's not true. I mean, you look at the popularity of some people on TikTok, for example, who have millions of followers who are sharing information. I mean, they have larger audiences than many newspapers do at the moment, and they aren't considered in terms of gatekeepers of information when they really are. And the fact this has become so scattered and hard to understand. I mean, there's new social media platforms that develop all the time, and they build audiences for certain personalities who become gatekeepers of information to their audience. And I think until you understand that and that fragmentation, you can't start seeing things in terms of the network. And that's really what's changed, is that now we're dealing with networks of information, not just gatekeepers at the kind of top of the pile. It's kind of no longer a triangle, it's just loads of nodes and how they connect to each other. So a lot of what we're trying to do at Bellingcat is saying, okay, how do we connect all these different nodes together to produce useful, kind of actionable information that can have a positive impact? And that comes in many different forms. So we've done lots of work on legal accountability using open source information, because that's kind of taking the stuff we've been seeing in past conflicts like Syria, for example, or with MH17, and asking the question, why doesn't this stuff get used for legal accountability? And the answer is because no one's figured out how to do it yet. So we find ourselves in this very strange position of working with international courts and prosecutors to explain to them what open source investigation is and why it possibly might be useful for what they're doing. Unfortunately, they get it. It's really about creating a process where that evidence can be used in court on an equal level as other evidence that you would gather in more traditional ways. But we aren't going to them saying, we're going to replace your legal process with open source investigation, because that's crazy. What we're doing is saying, this is valuable, but we need to be able to provide it to you on the terms that you can use it, and then combine it with your more traditional methods of investigation and prosecution. And it's the same for anything. It's the same for journalism as well. How do we take this new process, integrate it with the traditional forms of journalism? Because newspapers aren't going to vanish overnight, and actually then use them as, there's still a level of trust in those newspapers that doesn't exist elsewhere. I mean, if you read something in the New York Times, you're going to believe it more than if you read it on TikTok. And it's actually saying, how do we take that and then apply it to these traditional forms of journalism or traditional forms of anything, really?
Okay, but that's like the how-to. That's how companies, organizations, authorities, or media organizations should do it. Do you think they'll manage to do it? Like, will they be the storytellers, like 10 or 20 years to come?
I mean, it's really up to them.
You traveled so much. You met so many of these companies. You've taught them how to do things. You taught them things that are obvious to do, that you kind of found out being a blogger 2012. And I guess you were amazed that media companies that you respected went to you and asked, well, how did you do that?
So I think in the last 2 years especially, we've seen a lot of media organisations who've started recognising the value of open source investigation, in particular with the conflict in Ukraine. So back 5 years ago, I was spending a lot of time with journalists, training them how to do this work. And you'd have kind of bits and pieces there where we would pick up stories that would get into the mainstream media, but there wasn't really that internal capacity to do the work. Now you have teams that are set up like BBC Verified, for example, that has been directly influenced by the work of Bellingcat. That evolved from another team called BBC Africa Eye, which was really established because partly of a training I did with the BBC team. So that's grown, and that's great to see. So now you've got the New York Times doing it, the Financial Times has just set up a team, CNN's doing it. And that's really important because it means that other news organisations are going to see that and think, well, if they're doing it, we need to start doing it. So my hope is in the future that at least within major media, we will see lots of organisations building teams to do this.
Okay, so all of that gives you hope. I can hear that. But is it necessary for media organisations to be the one that survives? Isn't it like hope itself that organisations like yourself has created all this reach and these methods, and that we could see like a new generation of... You don't even need to call them journalists. You didn't like to call yourself a journalist. You're storytellers doing the work of journalists. And that's how media will develop.
Yeah, it's really about who's going to pay for this, because Bellingcat, I started off in my spare time. It built into an organisation because of crowdfunding, and that is not a sustainable business model. It might work here and there, but it's often with very specialised media who can, get a certain audience who wants to pay for that specific content. The question we have is, how do we fund all of this? And part of that is going to be through legacy media, because they've got the audience, they've got the way of generating income.
Yeah, but that's today. Do you think so even tomorrow, that part of this will be always through legacy media?
I mean, I expect so.
Okay.
It's God knows what's going to happen in 20 years' time that might collapse it. I mean, we couldn't have predicted the impact the internet would have on the media in general. Yeah. I mean, the way kind of streaming services have kind of dominated the way we consume media now. I mean, there's always going to be changes and evolutions, and there's going to be some organisations that live and some that die, but they're going to be profit-making organisations.
But do you feel like Bellingcat has kind of worked out the solution to this? Like, do you have a sustainable business model that other, people or networks could be inspired by?
Well, we're sustainable at the moment. The thing is, we get about 30% of our income we generate ourselves through things like workshops, which is good to have. And then you have about another 60% that comes through various donations. That's kind of where the problem starts occurring, because when the economy is great and then these funders make money and they can then pass it on to groups like ours, it's fantastic. When there's an economic crisis that could be happening even now, then that starts becoming a problem. And if you have more organisations like Bellingcat competing for the same pot of money, then what are we going to do? It puts us in a difficult position. Now, a lot of our work is about kind of, regarding our finances, is building that kind of nest egg just in case that happens. But if you're starting an organisation like Bellingcat now, you need good funders. And the one big issue is that the money for doing this kind of work, a lot of it is being offered by governments. And we don't take that money as Bellingcat, but there's other organisations that do. But immediately then you're kind of undermining your reputation by taking government money like that. So you kind of end up being in a bit of a bind, because the only people who want to take that money tend to be like comms organisations who are used to working with governments on comms issues, and they think of it in terms of disinformation being a comms issue, which is kind of where they start focusing.
So the business model, of course, is what probably will shape the media company or journalism or whatever, or storytellers, or whatever you want to call them in the future. I do want to talk about disinformation, of course, how it is developing. And of course now everyone is talking about AI. And I did this demo just yesterday for on media about 11 Labs, how it clones voices and you can type in text and pretty much give a speech to the Prime Minister of Sweden, and he will speak it in his own voice and things like that. And of course, then it will highlight even more how important it is to have a skill set again, and to train not only journalists but the public on how to kind of know when it's authentic or not. What are your views on how this will unfold?
What we're seeing at the moment is the issue is really not about what people believe, it's what they then choose not to believe, because they can point at something and say, well, that's probably AI generated, well, I shouldn't believe it.
Yeah, okay, so the thing here will be what? What will be like the Bellingcat thing to do? Is it to educate people in what?
Well, in a sense, it's because we work in terms of kind of information and evidence. As information, it's a big problem because it means that people, the way they work, use social media, you see something and within 2 seconds you made a decision about to retweet it. And the problem is if that's an AI generated image, they're so good now you won't be able to tell the difference. But if it's something that's a huge topic, then usually there'll be a kind of network of information around that topic. So in terms of information, it's a problem. And I think there needs to be a way for social media companies to kind of embed AI detection software to flag things like that.
Do you think we'll actually have, I kind of feel, take comfort in that we've been able to handle Photoshop during the last couple of decades. And when Photoshop came and it was publicly accessible, everybody just had this real scare of how will we ever know what's a real picture or not. But obviously we managed pretty well somehow. So I take some comfort in that. But still, like in your example now, you said, well, you could look at a picture and then you could see something was off. But that's like no, that's like not even a year in Midjourney being good.
Absolutely.
So in the future, like in let's say 5 or 10 years from now, will we even be able, will anyone be able to know what's a real photo or not?
I think, I said before, we work on it in terms of information and evidence. As information, that could get very difficult, but when we use it as evidence, it's part of a network of information around an incident. So if there's, a bomb goes off in a conflict, you could generate an image that shows that, but if it's on a street in some random town in some random country, AI isn't going to be able to create an accurate version of that street. And you have this situation where you might think, oh, AI can generate a whole load of network of information. But even if it could do that, you have independent organizations, satellite imagery companies, who could show you it's false.
Oh, yeah. So you kind of feel comfort or take comfort in that there are so many other things than just the image or just the video that makes us know if something is real or not.
Yeah, and that's great for when you're doing investigations and you're building a case. But again, as information that can go viral, it doesn't really matter because it takes you a long time to do that investigation. Stuff can go viral within hours. Yeah. And then that's what people start believing. And once someone sees something and believes it, it's very often very difficult to change their mind.
Yeah. And of course, with the abundance of information, people tend to just take whatever feels right to be the truth. I guess that's a big problem with the internet and with everybody being also a publisher. I once coined everyone is a journalist, which was not very popular among journalists to say, but perhaps everyone is a publisher is definitely true. And speaking about all this that you talked about, that you trained journalists into doing and into thinking and into exploring, I guess it's even more important to train the public now, because they are the one retweeting, resharing, or reposting stories that ultimately makes them publishers in a sense on their own social media accounts.
Again, that's why I think we need to start education earlier. We need to be doing this in schools. We can't just assume that people are going to be good at social media because they got a smartphone when they were 11, because that's definitely not the case.
Yeah. Are you scared about the future or worried?
The thing is, I'm more worried about the environment than, it might be great that we're fighting disinformation, but then if everything's 5 degrees hotter in, 60 years time.
It's kind of connected as well, I guess.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a big part of that, but I think, there are big issues in the world that we face, and they're all really interconnected. I mean, the idea of, climate disinformation is something that is a big issue. Abby Richards, who I'm with for the Win-Win Prize, she was very heavily involved in researching that, and it's being combined now with other conspiracy theories. And some of them are quite wild and crazy conspiracy theories, but there's this kind of underlining climate denialism that comes along with them. And because they aren't directly saying global warming is fake, people might find them fun to read about and believe. And I think that can be hugely damaging. So, we've started doing more work on the environment at Bellingcat, but that's really about investigation rather than debunking disinformation. And I think that's really important for the future, that people really understand the issues that are at stake, because the time it will take us to turn this around is in terms of decades, not centuries at this point. So we really need to understand the issues now, not in 50 years' time.
I want to finish on a positive note. What gives you hope when working with all of these?
I think I've seen more and more over the last decades, more work being done with open source investigation, a better understanding of how disinformation spreads, how we can address that as, addressing the causes rather than the symptoms of why people get drawn into these communities. There's a lot of work to be done, but I've seen people, really rise to it. I mean, we're working now on issues around legal accountability that I think even 5 years ago would have been unimaginable that we could be doing the stuff that we're doing now and have the engagement that we have in that work. So there's a lot of, good stuff that is being done. It's just really up to making sure we continue to do it and keep expanding it.
Eliot Higgins, very nice to talk to you, and congratulations again to the Win-Win Board.
Thank you.